Where's my restream? It says streaming, receiving your content. All right, our pictures are showing up. Maybe. I've had some technical difficulties in the past with Peter Hitchens on. So I was like, wait for like somebody to show up in the chat and say, "Is audio okay?" Like, and then they say yes, okay, and I'm like, all right, we're good. It's like my yeah. Can you hear us? Can you make sure the sound is good? We got native atheists in here. Is the sound good? Is the sound good for both of us? Especially since I just got a new mic. I want to make sure everything sounds good. All right, cool. All right, it looks like we're live. You're up.
All right, well, hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden, your host, and I am excited to introduce my special guest to you. He is the first atheist to come onto the show and do an interview with me, so I'm super excited to introduce Tom Jump, also known as TJump from YouTube. Tom, how are you doing today?
All right, 1 second. They said they can't hear the other guy. All right.
Can't hear me? Okay.
Now speak. See.
Can
Say
you hear
some
me now?
sound test. Sound test. Can they hear the other guy?
Sound test, 1, 2, 1, 2. Can anybody hear me out there?
Oh, wow. Do not know why that's happening. Let's see if I can figure that out. Desktop audio. Why is the desktop audio not working? Oh, they can't hear you.
They cannot?
You could hear it. You could hear you on the Facebook Live.
Yeah, I can hear you at least.
Yeah, I don't think they say your sound is really low. I'm not sure why. All right, let's see. Test now. Is the sound?
Mic check. 1 2 1 2. Does it sound good?
How is the sound now?
Mic check. 1 2 1 2.
So
Can you hear?
they say they hear you on Facebook, but not on the other one. That's weird.
So they can hear me on Facebook,
Apparently.
but not on
All right,
YouTube.
I fixed it. We're good. We're good. All right,
We're
go
good.
ahead.
We're good.
We're
All
good.
right. Cue the intro one more time. Hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I am excited to introduce my special guest to you. He is the first atheist to agree to come on to the show and do an interview, so I'm super excited to introduce to you none other than Tom Jump, also known as TJump from YouTube. Tom, how are you doing today, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invite.
No, I really appreciate you coming on. As I mentioned, first atheist to take me up on an interview. I know everybody's busy and stuff, but I have actually been trying to get somebody to come on to discuss kind of the other side. I do a lot of interviewing apologists, theologians, philosophers, Christian philosophers, that sort of stuff. So I'm super excited for this. Real quick for your audience, I have not taken over Tom's channel as the host. I just don't do my stuff live, and he does, and so we agreed to do it this way for however that works out. But anyway, nice to meet everybody. My name's Hayden, as I said. Tom, why don't you give us a brief introduction, at least for my audience? I know obviously your audience is familiar with who you are, but if you don't mind doing a brief intro for my audience.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean there are no reasons to believe in the existence of God, and I run a YouTube channel where I debate professional expert theologians, professors, and philosophers in order to demonstrate this is the case. I wrote an epistemology and model of morality, which I'm putting into a book, and I use these as the basis of my arguments, my original arguments, to debate with these people. I hope to get this book published pretty soon. I'm trying to find a publisher. I have it on it's like my next Patreon goal, or essentially to try and get it published. And I've been doing this for about, I think, 8 months continuously. I started my YouTube channel about 2 years ago, but I just posted like 1 or 2 videos occasionally every few months. I started doing it seriously about 8 months ago, and it's gone extremely well. I have a big following, a lot of really generous people who support me and that have allowed me to do this like full time now, which is really awesome.
Wow, nice.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of really big names who were willing to come on and have a conversation with me, like Peter Hitchens, Paul Copan, Robin Collins, and Josh Rasmussen, Randall Rouser, all these really big philosophers and cosmologists like Luke Barnes and astrophysicists like Jeff Zweerink, who are willing to come on and have conversations with me about the various arguments for and against the existence of God. So I've been really lucky that they have been kind enough to come on and have conversations with essentially a nobody, and it's a really awesome experience.
Yeah, you're not nobody, not anymore at least. And I kind of feel the same way. It was kind of weird for me when I first started my channel. I'm like, I'm just some other guy starting a stupid channel. But I would send emails to these like bigger named Christian apologists and philosophers and stuff, and they were very receptive to come on. I was like, wow, this is actually surprising. So you kind of feel the same way how receptive people were to come on?
Yeah, it's been really surprising when you initially start off thinking about you're going to invite like a professor on to your channel.
Yeah,
They're just going to blow you off. No one's gonna
yeah,
listen to you. But when you start sending emails like, yes, we'd love to come on your channel. That would be really
yeah, yeah.
cool. And they're always open to have conversations, and it's a really really cool that they're willing to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be alive. I really like it. I think people are starting to take, there used to be this kind of dichotomy between academics and the professional, academics to be redundant, but and the lay audience or whatever. But I think that as technology has advanced and things like YouTube have come out, that there's that gap is kind of, I wouldn't say it's going away. There's still a difference, but they're kind of converging together. You feel the same way?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because in academics, there are a lot of people who never got degrees who made huge impacts in the field of especially philosophy and science, who were just completely autodidacts and taught themselves. And now
Sure.
it seems like in the like atheist community, people who aren't experts or in the field or in the scientific community can still make an impact by making YouTube videos and being
Oh
public
yeah.
speakers. And like Bill Nye is an engineer. He's got nothing to do with most scientific fields, but he's still one of the leading scientific speakers in the world right now. And so this social media opportunity that has been granted to us gives lay people essentially the opportunity to make an impact academically where before they probably couldn't.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So what made you start debating theists and kind of getting into more of like the apologetic side of it?
Well, I started having conversations with my local pastors, and they couldn't really answer my questions or address my concerns. It just kind of fell back into the biblical rhetoric for the most part. And so I went to local professors at the local colleges around here, started going to coffee shops, inviting them to go out. Some of the earliest people I talked to, I was lucky enough to have a conversation with Greg Boyd and Paul Eddies, who wrote
Okay.
the Jesus Legend,
Hmm.
and I got a signed copy of their book. That was really cool. And talking with those guys, I realized that I can really grapple with the professionals in the fields of these topics and have a really interesting conversation. And so I decided to start like posting them online to see, like I became confident enough to post them online and to get
Yeah.
feedback. And then I had my like first serious conversations with like Blake Junta, the philosopher, and Dr. David Clark, who's a big professor, a big apologist professor. And those went exceptionally well. And so I just started to keep going with it, and it's grown bigger and bigger since then.
Cool. So, but it initially just started with like a kind of a sense of wonder or a want for truth, and so you're just kind of seeking answers. Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, after I lost my faith, I started really researching hard into the philosophy when I found like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, those kind of guys. Watching
Sure.
those videos really inspired me, and I got interested in it and thought they were just the greatest thing in the world until I started to meet the philosophers and then realized that the philosophy behind these guys wasn't that great. And so I started to meet some better arguments, and then I wanted
No.
to challenge those arguments like, well, how do I find out if these are actually really good or not? And so I brought them to the experts on the other side of the fence because I think the best way to really learn, as expressed by John Stuart Mill, is that if you only know your own side of the issue, you know little of that. So you
Yeah.
should always have your ideas challenged in a debate kind of a format from people who have really studied the other side to be able to point out the weaknesses that you don't see in your own. And
Yeah.
that's how that led me to those conversations with the big theists around here in Minnesota, like Greg Boyd.
Mhm. So you've had on, I mean, just numerous of people that you disagree with. I mean, at like the most fundamental level, like at the metaphysical level, we have you and I have a fundamental disagreement, and everybody that pretty much that you've had on your show, you got a fundamental disagreement. But as far as I can tell, like your, would you say your overall experience has been very positive or cordial?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that with a few exceptions when I'm sick, there's been two debates where I was just sick and I was just very cranky. But other than those, they've all been really good conversations. I think that even though we disagree on most things, I think we can agree on certain things like the difference between our imagination and our experience and the laws of
Sure.
logic and math and those kinds of things. And if we start with those common grounds, we can build on that to try and understand the differences between our position without just saying, oh, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree. We can actually
Yeah.
discuss why we have these different positions and the justifications behind them. And when we go down that intellectual route, it seems like everyone's really cordial. I mean, even people who you are expected to not be cordial, like
Yeah.
Ken Ham or Kent Hovind.
Have
I've
you had
had
Ken
really
Ham on?
not yet. I'm
Oh,
trying to get
okay.
him, but I've had several debates with Kent Hovind, and they've always
Yeah.
been extremely cordial. I mean, we've never gotten into an argument or a fight at all. And most people think he's like one of the most dishonest people in the world. Like Aaron Ra claims that about him all the time, but he's
Yeah.
not. You just have to learn how to communicate in a honest way without trying to insult each other, and
Sure.
starting with those same basic groundworks of like the laws of logic and the difference between our imagination and our experience.
Sure. Well, I'll be honest, that's what I like most about you, and I just want to commend you to not only your own audience, they already know, but my audience as
Thank you.
well. That even before we came on, even yesterday, Tom was sending me a message on Facebook, like we're using, I don't even know what this program is right now to chat, and he was like, "Well, on Monday, we'll call each other and not post it live, and I'll help you kind of navigate and get used to it." And so that's just kind of the guy he is, and so I appreciate that about the way you do your dialogue, and it's a model that I want to do as well. So you're inspiring me.
Well,
So
thank you.
I think everybody should aspire to do that because, especially right now, you live here in the States as well. Like the political dialogue in this country, we're definitely not going down that route.
Yeah,
But the political dialogue in this country is just abominable. But there's atheists and Christians coming together on not only your channel but other channels who disagree. I would say at an even more fundamental place, and they're being very cordial. It's just it's nice to see.
yeah, I totally agree. I think that especially in the political realm, it's just all personal attacks and nobody's really discussing the issues, and it's a real tragedy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, that we kind of went off on a little tangent there, but that was cool. What? Let's talk about kind of your background. You mentioned that you walked away from your faith. How did you come to faith in the first place? I guess would be my first question.
I was born into a Christian family, raised Christian, always went to churches, went to a Catholic, I think a Catholic schools, both grade school and high school. So I was raised Catholic or Christian my entire life. And the reason I left was sometime in high school. I had a rather dark, depressing past, and I was always praying like morning and night, trying to find a way out of that. And none of my
Yeah,
prayers were ever answered. And so
yeah,
eventually I stopped being able to believe over time. And
mm,
so that's what led me away from faith, even though I was kind of born into it.
yeah. You said you were born into a Catholic, went to Catholic school. So would you say that you and your family, I guess, if you don't mind me asking, were were you pretty serious Christian, like, or would you? Because I know, like, most Christians are pretty. I say most Christians, that might be too strong, but a lot of Christians are just, they would check the box if you handed them a piece of paper that said, "What is your religion?" But or they might go on Sunday, but the other 6 days of the week they don't really care. So how would you have described your level of sincerity, I suppose?
Yeah, my mom is extremely devout. She reads the Bible every day, read it cover to cover like dozens of times. She's extremely devout in that respect. And many of the schools I went to were also extremely devout. I don't really know, because for me it was always a challenge since none of my prayers were ever answered. I was probably pretty devout in my childhood because I couldn't really not believe. But
Sure.
the longer I really considered it and the longer my prayers were answered, I eventually lost more and more of my faith. So I think
Okay.
my family overall was pretty serious, especially on my mom's side.
Yeah.
My dad's side, not as much, but my mom was really more the church religion person of the family.
Yeah, the moms are always more devout, man. When did you know? You said, was it in high school that you knew that you no longer believed or accepted that you no longer believed?
Yeah, it wasn't really like a singular event that I could just say, well, here's the date where I stopped being
Mhm.
Christian. It was more just, it kind of fizzled out. Like after praying and praying and praying and nothing happening, I eventually just stopped praying and stopped caring and stopped expecting anything to be there. It's like praying to a gallon of milk and nothing happening. Eventually, you just realize it's just a gallon of milk. It's not going to do anything. And that's kind of like how it was for me.
Sure.
I wouldn't say I identified as an atheist at that point because didn't really know what atheism was yet.
Yeah.
It took a few years after I stopped believing and actually got introduced to Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins that I really started to understand what an atheist was and the definition and the philosophy behind it. And that's when I started to identify as an atheist.
Yeah. Well, since it wasn't like an argument that talked you out of faith, do you think that an argument, even in, and I don't know what you would agree to, that's why I'm asking, but do you think that an argument, even in principle, could talk you back into faith?
Well, sure, because I value evidence more than anything else. And so it doesn't
Sure.
really matter what it is that you're proposing. If you can provide evidence for it, that's good enough for me. Like if you said there is a magical leprechaun who has a pot of gold, and then you demonstrated this by showing me it's over there, and I went and saw the pot of gold, I'm going to believe in the magic leprechaun, even if I don't like the idea of magic or
Uh,
the supernatural. So God would kind of be the same thing. If you could make novel, testable predictions for the existence of a God, then I would be willing to believe in it because it made testable predictions.
sure.
But it wouldn't. So it would in that case be arguments and evidence, probably not
Yeah.
arguments as much as like actual like scientific evidence that would convince me to go back to the faith.
Okay, so I think the distinction you're making, and correct me if I'm wrong, is less about, maybe a philosophical argument, but maybe more about something you can actually experience.
Right. I don't think a philosophical argument would ever convince me because of, especially specifically because of my epistemology, knowledge is broken up into three categories. You have conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Conceptual is like logic and math, is stuff in our heads, and
Okay.
arguments are of that kind. They're just of stuff in our heads, ways that we can articulate and describe reality. But you can't use an argument in order to indicate something existing. Like I couldn't argue unicorns exist and get you to believe unicorns exist. You'd actually need some kind of empirical evidence before it was reasonable to believe unicorns actually existed. And no
Mm,
argument could do that. And the same thing would apply to a God. If you want to claim that a God exists, is a real thing that isn't just imaginary, you're going to need more than just arguments for the same reason.
okay. When you say empirical, do you really mean something that you can sense or something material?
Not necessarily.
Okay. I was just saying because the examples you were giving kind of seemed like that, and then God would kind of fall outside of that category just kind of by his nature, and so you would just never, you just in principle could not have that kind of evidence. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, no, not necessarily. So, for example, if you wanted to say there was a supernatural thing, the way you would indicate the supernatural thing would be the same way you'd indicate a natural thing. You just use novel testable predictions. You'd say,
Okay,
I
I
believe
see what
there
you
is
mean.
a supernatural being who will grant or who will answer my prayer to make a gold brick appear in front of me. I pray to this being, a gold brick appears in front of me. That would be evidence of the supernatural being.
Sure.
So I wouldn't reject the possibility of the supernatural
You want to
just
see
because.
prediction.
Right, right. So
Okay.
that's how I would differentiate between things in our imagination and things that exist. And that
Yeah.
applies not only to the natural, but also to the supernatural.
Sure. Sure. So if you prayed to specifically the Christian God, for something pretty specific, and then it happened, would you think you would believe, or do you think you'd say maybe it was a coincidence?
Well, it depends. It would have to be like a repeatable, testable kind of a prediction. So it's
Yeah.
like
Can you give an example?
of the gold brick example. Like if every time I prayed to a god, I got a gold brick, that's good evidence. That would be good. That
Hey,
would that
that'd be
would
nice,
convince
that'd be
me.
nice.
Right, right.
I
So
think you'd have
that's
a genie and not a god.
right, right. But that would be just one example of the kind of testable predictions that
Okay.
would convince me. There could be other things, like we could go back in time and see Jesus rose from the dead. Like if Jesus
Yeah.
actually predicted he was going to rise from the dead and then did it, that's fantastic evidence. That's great. I would believe that. There are certain things that I wouldn't believe, like the omni properties. Even if we discovered that Jesus rose from the dead and that
Yeah.
there is a God who granted our prayers and made testable predictions, that wouldn't indicate that the God was all powerful, because that's a different kind of a claim. That would require a new kind of evidence that I don't think we have yet. But all the
Okay.
other things I definitely are grantable if we get the right kind of evidence.
Okay. We may come back to the omni property thing. That's the thing that tends to come up in your discussions. I do want to address that, but let's go to, okay, we talked about that. How do you define atheism? You were hinted at it earlier, but how would you actually define it? Because I know there's, or I think there's a difference amongst atheists as to how they would define it.
Right, so I would define atheism as the positive position that there are no reasons to believe in the existence of God. It's something close to the new atheist definition of a lack of belief,
Okay.
that the Christian God does not meet its burden of proof kind of a definition. I do not use the philosophical definition, which is the position that there are no gods. That I
Okay.
don't, because from my worldview, I think we should look at things epistemically. We
Mm,
should try and find the justification for it, and that's more important than whether or not it actually exists, the ontology behind it. So
it's more important.
right. I think it's more important. I think that
Okay.
you need to have the justification to believe something before you actually claim to believe something. And so if
Okay.
justification isn't there, whether or not you believe it exists just doesn't really interest me. It's all about the justification for me.
It's all about the justification, but the justification is the means by which we would come to the conclusion that the thing actually exists. Correct.
Right.
Okay, so it's not unimportant. You just think the method or the epistemological justification is more interesting.
Well, I think it's a lot more important of how you come to that conclusion than whether or not you believe it exists. Like if someone told me they believe the tooth fairy existed, like I don't care. Like, okay, that's nice, great for you. What I'm
Yeah.
interested in is why do you believe that? Can you give me evidence? Can you give me some kind
Sure.
of
Yeah, me
argument?
too. Yeah, yeah.
So that's
I
why I
just
think the epistemic thing is more important than whether or not they actually believe it exists. That's not
yeah.
as important to me.
Okay. Okay. I don't know. Has anyone okay, so the most common objection that I get on my blog posts, on my YouTube channel, on anything, is not from skeptics, is not from atheists at all. It's actually from Christians. And I don't know if atheists realize this or not, but there is a subset of Christians that absolutely does not want me to give evidence and reason for God. Like they super hate it that I do it. And I have to debate them more than I have to debate atheists, and which is bizarre to me. But they would actually take the same, they would give the same definition that you just gave, which is there are no reasons to believe. You just have blind faith. Have you thought of that?
Yeah, they're called fideists. So
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
the position that there is no way to know of God, you just believe it. And I'm totally fine with that. That is, from my perspective, an internally consistent position. If you want to just believe God exists and you grant that there's no arguments, I can't I can't disagree with that. I have nothing to counter that argument with because that's a perfectly consistent position. So,
Yeah.
because the only problem I have is that when I see the evidence and arguments presented to indicate the existence of God, they seem to all objectively fail. Like I can like demonstrate analytically why they do not work. And so if someone's claiming this argument indicates the existence of God, I see a contradiction there. Like it clearly doesn't. It's like saying the square root of a pork chop indicates the existence of leprechauns. Like, no, it does not. There's a problem there. But if you just say you believe in leprechauns, like I'm okay with that. I can't counter that. That's totally
Can't
fine.
counter that. But you also say that your epistemology, a priori excludes the possibility of making an argument for God, correct?
What do you mean?
Like you said, I earlier I asked you if a philosophical argument for the existence of God would ever convince you, and you said no because my epistemology would kind of rule that possibility out.
Well,
Or did I hear you wrong?
no, that's correct. But fideism isn't an argument for the existence of God. It's just saying we believe God exists. Well, you can say that. I'm totally okay with that. That's not a
No, yeah, I
justification.
know. Yeah, no, I know. I wasn't referring to fideism at that point. I was referring back to you saying that you would want to, you would have to give an argument.
Oh, right. So specifically, I'd mean like evidence um, rather than an argument in that case.
Okay, okay. What is okay? But given the philosophical arguments that you've heard, I recognize you don't find them to succeed, or you don't think that they're, good enough to warrant belief. But what would you say the best argument you've heard is?
Right. So I would say the best argument would be the contingency argument. I think that of all the arguments, that one actually indicates what it's espousing for, which is some necessary thing. There has to be a necessary thing that grounds the existence of everything else. I totally grant that. It makes perfect sense. It's perfectly reasonable. I'd say it's valid and sound,
Wow,
as
this.
opposed to the other arguments, which I think are completely unsound. They indicate nothing as far. They're just completely unnecessary. You can get rid of all the other properties, but the necessary one is actually necessary. That is a really good argument. But it doesn't indicate what the necessary thing is. It could be a god, it could be pantheism or deism, polytheism, Pastafarianism, transtheism, omnism. There's a whole bunch of possibilities, but I do grant that that argument does indicate something. So, which could be a god, and so that argument is the best one that theists have. It at least points us in the direction of some kind of necessary something.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. So you grant that there's a necessary be do you grant that there's a necessary being that is the ground of all existence?
A necessary something. Because the being in philosophy, the word being just means existence. So a
Right.
necessary being would be fine. But normally, when people hear the word being, they think of a conscious agent, like a being, a personal being.
N
So I
Yeah, I
grant that
just
there
mean
is,
something that exists. Yeah.
right. So I grant there has to be a necessary thing that exists to ground everything. I grant that.
Mhm.
But that could mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean something outside of space and time. It could be an infinite regress that is the necessary set of things, when that is a possible necessary thing in itself. And it could be something that's eternal. It could be something that has different kinds of time. It could be something we don't even imagine. So we don't know exactly what the qualities of that necessary thing are, but there does have to be some necessary thing that
Is there
makes
I
this that makes the
are there
statement there was at some point a philosophical nothing false. That statement has to be false.
Right. Yeah. Um, let's see, what was I gonna ask? Is there anything that you would rule out that could not even in principle be the necessary being?
Anything that isn't necessary, again, I don't know exactly what that would mean. It's kind of circular, so
Okay.
I don't really know what kind of limits we can place on what necessary means,
Yeah.
but it's going to have to be something pretty cool, pretty interesting, probably beyond our comprehension. So I
Yeah.
would say probably like pineapples are not it. Maybe they
Right.
could be, but I'm going to guess
Well,
not.
material. Well, what about a material thing? Could a material thing, even in principle, be a necessary being?
Oh, absolutely. We don't know the extent of all material things. We only know the qualities of the known material things. So you could say it can't be any of the known material things, which I'm willing to grant, but you can't say it isn't a material thing because the unknown material can have properties of that we have no idea about. There could be lots of material properties out there we haven't discovered yet
So
because
you
of
think that could there be an uncomposed material thing?
I have no idea what that even means. It's
Well,
possible.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that philosophers and apologists who make the contingency argument would say that because a material thing is composed, therefore it could be decomposed or fail to exist, and therefore it cannot even in principle be a necessary thing.
Well, that's only true of the known material things. There could definitely be
Mhm.
like a singular thing, which is just pure existence, kind of like the
Li-
Thomistic argument,
Like
which
the
just,
Thomistic argument.
right. So it could be a material thing that has that similar property where it isn't a composition of other things. There could be a base material thing.
Okay. Well, it can't be from the Thomistic because he would say that even if this material thing would have a form, or on the Thomistic philosophy at least, and therefore it couldn't be the necessary existence. Because Thomas Aquinas would say that this is uh, this plays into what you talk about when you talk about the omni properties. That for Aquinas, the omni properties necessarily follow from the necessarily existing thing. Um, I guess we can go to the omni property thing if you wanted to tell me how you feel about omni properties and explain your thoughts on that.
Right, so just to pick up on that a little bit, even material things can be formless. For example, there are certain theories in physics that promote the idea of things existing outside of space and time. For example, Sean Carroll's emergent spacetime and Nima Arkani-Hamad's amplituhedron, and the multiple kinds of time like two-time physics by Itzel Bars, and the end of time by Julian Barber, and imaginary time by Stephen Hawking. So material things aren't limited to the brackets we place around them. Those are only the known material properties, like when we say it's has some kind of a form or it's some kind of a composite. All of that stuff just describes the known material things. What the unknown material has is just unknown. It could be essentially anything. We have no idea. And so we can't place limits on what the material, the unknown material could be like or what it could do. And so it's equally as reasonable to say that the unknown material could be formless, timeless, spaceless, eternal base of everything as it would be to say that a god could do so or a supernatural thing could do so.
I think at that point the response would just be that's kind of redefining what matter is. Of things like at that point that's just not matter. A
Well, like,
formless, spaceless, timeless thing is that's just if you call that material, I think you're just kind of calling it material. I don't think it would actually be material anymore.
well, that's the confusion that most theists have is that they think that the scientific definition is somehow binding to reality, which it's not. Our scientific definition of matter is just our tentative provisional explanation of what we can experience so far, and it goes nowhere beyond that. So if we
Okay.
were talking about what goes outside of that to the unknown natural, we can't place limitations on that. All of the stuff that we describe as matter only applies to the known kind, and that's it, full stop. And that applies to everything in science. It's only
Okay.
about the known stuff. And
Yeah.
what goes beyond that, we have no idea.
Okie doke. I gotta switch gears. Sorry, got some more questions I want to get to for the audience. What are some common misconceptions that you think that Christians have about atheists?
Um, well, I mean, I know from the Pew poll studies that atheists are the most distrusted group in America. I think that's probably the big
Yeah.
one.
Why do
Other
you think
than
that is? Why do you think that is?
I think that people have this intuitive belief that if you have a moral system that is objective, that it makes you more moral intrinsically, and that because atheists reject the idea of some objective moral system, that they're more socialist or relativistic, and that their values are kind of wishy-washy and could change at any minute. And I think that's something that people feel intuitively, especially given the past history of atheism in the Soviet Union and Mao and Pol Pot and those kinds of leaders who
Sure.
were attributed to atheism.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a pretty big misconception. Okay, but you think that there is a ground for objective morality, even on an atheistic worldview, correct?
Right, I do. I am like most philosophers. Most philosophers are atheists. I think it's 74% or something from the
Sure.
forget Phil Survey's paper, but and 50 something percent believe in moral realism. So
Hmm.
50% believe in objective morality, even though most are atheists.
Yeah.
So
What?
most atheists believe in objective morality. You don't need a God for that. There's lots of
Sure.
different ways to argue for that.
So whenever I say objective, I mean, and I think most people mean, there must be a standard that exists between you and me that are independent of you and me by which we can judge moral judgments. Like, you should not do that. Well, you shouldn't, because here's the standard by which we adjudicate to say that you shouldn't do that.
Right,
What
a mind independent standard, right? Or an
sure.
opinion
So,
independent.
so do you agree with that? And if so, what is the mind independent standard?
Yes, I do agree with that. So I think that we can have mind independent standards of even abstract concepts, like a triangle. If you add up all the angles of a triangle, it will add up to 180. That's just objectively the case. It's mind independent. You don't get an opinion on it. It's just something that's a fact. So I
No.
think the same kind of principle can apply to morality, and we can look for commonalities given like philosophical problems like the trolley problem and the fat guy problem and the guy walking into a hospital save 5 lives problem. And if we look at all of those philosophical problems of morality, we can find certain kinds of similarities and use those similarities to build a model that'll lead us in the direction of what we can call objective morality or the objective standard. And I call that the best of all possible worlds.
Okay. What about, so I've always, to be honest, and I don't know if the Christian audience is going to like this or not, but I've never, it may be true, I don't know, but I've never found the moral argument convincing, honestly.
Oh, really? That's
I've
surprising.
always, yeah, but yeah, it was really surprising whenever I hear William Lane Craig say this is the best one or the most convincing one. I've heard him say before, and I mean, as a wannabe Christian apologist guy on YouTube, I have the utmost respect for William Lane Craig, obviously, and he's in a league I'll probably never be in, and so I'm probably wrong. But uh, he says when he goes on college campuses and stuff that this is like the best argument that he gives, which surprised him. He thought the Kalam would be. But I feel like I don't know. I'm less convinced that premise one is true the more and more I go on. And it's not because I know that atheists can be moral. I'm not confusing the epistemology with the metaphysics here. Pretty sure, I think you could ground morality kind of like Aristotle does.
Platonic
And it wouldn't,
abstracts.
I'm sorry.
Like Platonic objects, kind of a Platonic morality.
I don't. Aristotle wouldn't. I don't think agree with a Platonic realm of forms and things and abstract objects, but he would say it's just grounded in human nature, and it is the nature of a human being to tend toward human flourishing. And as far as well, why would you? Who says we ought to tend towards human flourishing? You don't have a choice. You just do. It's just a fact of nature. That's what happens. And there's good ways and there's bad ways of tending toward human flourishing, and the good ways we call morally good and the bad ways we call morally bad. That doesn't seem to me to require a God. I would argue that the best explanation of human nature is God, but that would be a cosmological argument, like something Thomas Aquinas would give. But anyway, as far as I can tell, like and actually Thomist philosophers, this I go to a school. I'm studying philosophy, an MA in philosophy, and it's a Thomist school. And pretty much everybody there agrees as well that they don't really like the moral argument that well either.
Yeah.
So have you, what do you think about Aristotle's moral philosophy like that?
Well, I think the main objection to Aristotle's is that if morality is a result of evolution, it's still contingent or subjective on
Sure.
our brain processes, which would make it like subject to something like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. Why would we think this is
Hmm.
true as opposed to just a social construction or something like that? So, but I totally agree with you that the first premise of the moral argument is really, really weak because it's a claim that is extremely um, it's a strong claim. It's saying that the only way to get objective moral values and duties is through a God. And the way to debunk that is just present a different way to get objective moral values and duties, and you've defeated the argument.
Mm.
And I do that by just saying, well, morality could just be an undiscovered law of nature.
Hmm.
That does it. There is a mind opinion independent basis of objective morality that is not a God and can be just as objective. And since I can present this alternative, the first premise kind of falls flat because it just claims God is the only way to do it.
Yeah.
And so because it's making such a strong claim on such weak evidence, it is pretty easy to deconstruct the moral argument in that
Hmm.
way.
Well, and I also have a selfish reason for not wanting the moral argument to succeed, and that is because if atheists start accepting it, they're going to start acting like moral relativists, and I don't want to live in a world like that. So,
Right.
if we can all have moral realism, I'll be perfectly happy with that. I will stick to cosmological arguments. But I don't think anybody's going to do that anytime soon. But um, are there any other common misconceptions that you can think of that atheists have? I mean, excuse me, that Christians or just religious people in general have of atheists?
Well, I'm not really sure of atheists in particular, but I definitely know that they have several misconceptions about atheism in general. Like,
Yeah,
for
sure, that's
example,
fine. Yeah.
they say that, for example, God is the only way to account for morality, or God is the only way to account for logic, and atheists can't account for logic or morality or the uniformity of nature or uh, intelligibility. They think that the atheist worldview is, or in science in general, is just unable to account for these things. And that is the biggest misconception that theists have from my perspective, is that yes, atheists in science can account for all of these things. We can account for them as biological results of evolution, like you said about evolution, or we could say that we could make up new things like undiscovered laws of nature and just create equally as plausible explanations as a god, but they're just from a secular perspective. So scientists and atheists can explain all of these things just like theists can. They just usually prefer to withhold judgment and not make those leaps beyond what the evidence can support. And again,
Hmm.
that's the biggest misconception I think theists have, is that they think, oh no, science and atheists, they just logically can't explain this. It's just impossible for them to do it.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case.
Yeah. Well, just coming back to it, and whenever I was telling you I wasn't sure about the moral argument, and you said, well, I think the number one response has to do with evolution. That's almost kind of my point, though, whenever I say I think atheists can have this, is because whenever you start saying, well, consider planting as evolutionary argument, and a lot of times whenever Dr. Craig will make his moral argument, he doesn't, whenever he gets to the part where he says, atheists can't have this, it's not because of a lack of God. It's really because of evolution or because of determinism or something like that. It's not per se, it doesn't per se have to do with the lack of there being a God. It really has to do with evolution or determinism, which there are theological determinists and there are theological theistic evolutionists, however you want to call them. So, I mean, he may say, well, yeah, they're equally wrong. But my point is, it's not God per se that is the factor here. It's really those other things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I just think there's a lot of theists who believe that is not the case. They think that
Oh, yeah,
it
no, I
really
know,
is,
yeah.
it's the
And
God.
I don't
That's
know
who
that
we
it
need.
is. I'm just, making observations here,
Right, right.
trying to be as, objective as possible here. I don't really care if the moral argument succeeds or not. I've got a million other ones. I think I have a million other ones. Um, so the most common misconception I get is that you guys are a bunch of Satanists.
Well, I mean, Satanism is an atheist movement, actually, which is pretty funny. Like
Yeah,
they give out
right.
cards at my atheist group at my college. There's actually a couple of my friends there who actually have Satanist cards because you can buy them. It's pretty
Is this
funny.
just like a trolling type of thing? Like,
Yes,
yeah, okay.
yes. The
Well,
Satanist is just like the spaghetti monster movement. It's just a
you,
completely trolling of Christianity, and that's it.
yeah, you're trolling all of the baby boomer generation people that are going, they're Satanists.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay. So have you ever had a seemingly religious experience or maybe something that you were like, whoa, don't know how to explain that?
No, I haven't. I think if I had, especially when I was praying as much as I would, I think I'd probably still be a Christian. And so I haven't, as far as I can tell, remember any case that I thought of something miraculous that could be explained by God or would be explained by God. I think I was just in so much emotional pain that if I had experienced something like that to relieve me from the pain, I probably would still be a Christian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just personally, I hate that, and I'm sorry for all the pain and stuff that you've gone through. I've never been through a battle of depression or anything like that, so I certainly don't understand what that's like. But yeah, anyway, um, I feel really sorry that you had to do that or you had to go through that, and that you know, I get. I don't have all the answers as to why God would or would not. Like from my perspective, God does exist, and for whatever reason, He clearly did not, answer the prayers in the way at least that you wanted. But
Well, thank you.
so
I appreciate your concern.
yeah, well, I mean, just sincerity. I mean, that is probably um, that. Actually, I won't say that the divine hiddenness is. I don't think that's a very good argument. But the argument from evil, or however you want to say that, the problem of evil is probably. Would you agree that that's probably this? That's not really. I don't know if you consider that evil, but you get what I mean. Would you think that that's probably the strongest argument against God? Actually.
Right, the problem of suffering. I think it's the second best argument. I think there's a better one, which is my specific version of the problem of suffering called the problem of
Okay.
involuntary suffering. I had this conversation with Dr. Chris Gadsden and Rick Mattson. It's essentially my original argument that they haven't heard before, and it stumps Christians pretty well. It's a pretty strong argument that says,
Okay, let's hear it.
all right, so if God forced a person to be in this world without their consent, that's an immoral action. And it would have been morally superior if he had given them the option to choose to be in this world with all the suffering and whatever benefits God has in this world, or to choose to go to a different world of their choosing. Because God did not do that, then he must necessarily not be a morally perfect being, because a morally perfect being would have chosen the more moral option, which would be to give each individual the option to be in this world or a different world. And the same thing applies to hell. If the morally superior option is to give someone the choice to go to heaven or hell, or some third option of going to their own universe, and forcing them to choose between heaven or hell without their consent is effectively slavery, and a morally perfect being couldn't do that.
Okay. I think for the Christian theology, like within the Christian theistic worldview, would be, excuse me, that God did not force human beings to exist in the world that it is right now. Um, you were a Christian once. I'm sure you're familiar with the opening chapters of Genesis. That that world that Adam and Eve were brought into. Of course, you're correct in that they didn't have a choice in that they existed, but at least the Christian response would be that world was pretty dang good, and they didn't have anything to complain about.
All right, but I'm making a stronger argument. I'm saying each individual, like including everyone born today, should be given the option to be in this world or be in the other world. The fact that Adam and Eve, even if they chose to be in this world, you can't impose that choice on everyone else also, because then it would be immoral to force all of those other people to be here without their consent. So it applies to every individual. If God forced a single individual into this world without giving them the option to go to a different world, that itself would be an immorality, and a perfect being couldn't do that.
Okay. I mean, if he just left us to our own devices, first of all, God is God. I mean, he can kind of do whatever he wants with his creation. But if he left us to our own devices, and that there was no escape from this world, because there is suffering and there is horrible things going on. Nobody denies that. I mean, I might feel the same way if I came to the conclusion that God existed, and we were just kind of left to this suffering. That's all there was. I might come to the same kind of apathetic response where, like, well, screw you. I don't care. Why would I worship you? But I think the Christian theological biblical response would be, God is not distant from this. He took on human flesh, as you know, or as you know the story goes at least, and Jesus became incarnate and not only became a human, but suffered himself, and we would say suffered the worst suffering that any human could possibly bear, and took all that upon himself. And so that there is this third alternative. It's not between here and hell. There's also eternity with God, which would be a reality that is whatever you think, whatever universe you might think you want to exist in. God, I think the response would be, God as an omniscient being, which you don't grant the omni properties, would know even better, and know that heaven, or the new heaven and earth that he's going to create, is even better than that universe.
Well, I
Does that
can
make
make it
sense?
even better. I can even grant most of that. Well, the first thing is,
Okay, cool. Yeah, sure.
Jesus did not suffer the worst thing humans could suffer. There's far worse uh, forms of suffering than crucifixion. The Japanese forms of torture were a lot worse. But
Okay, yeah. So I mean, taking on this sort of, maybe I don't necessarily mean his physical suffering, but the fact that he bore our sins, which is something I can't really express, like, because it's not like necessarily a physical thing, though there obviously is that physical element of it, but maybe it's emotional, psychological. I don't know how to explain that, to be honest. But the idea that he was bearing our sins on the cross would be, I think, something incomprehensibly painful.
so I mean, that may be the case. But my main point would be that, for example, I didn't choose to be here. If given the
Sure.
option, I would choose to go to my own universe in a
Well, I'm
heartbeat.
glad you're in this universe, first of all.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I'm enjoying this.
I'm glad you're enjoying my suffering.
You're not suffering. I
So, but
mean,
I would choose to go to my own universe in a heartbeat. And the fact that I'm forced to be here without my consent and I didn't agree to be here, I think is a immorality that if a God existed, that he would be culpable for. So he couldn't be a perfectly moral being because he has imposed an immorality on me by forcing me to be here without my consent. And it
yeah.
wouldn't just apply to me, it would apply to every person, all the atheists, all of the non-Christians, everyone who was forced to be in this world of suffering without their consent would have been suffered an injustice because they weren't given the option to choose otherwise.
Sure. Okay. Well, switching gears here, I got some more questions I want to get to. tell me about your epistemology or this philosophy that you have constructed. You say it's in a book form. Tell me about it.
All right, so my morality, my model of objective morality, as we described it, essentially is described as the best of all possible worlds, which we've been
Sure.
talking about. My epistemology can be broken down into essentially the principle that conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. That's essentially the summary of my epistemology. It essentially just says the logic and math and arguments and all of those kinds of things that come up in our head are like languages. They're formal languages as stated in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And so no combination of those things is going to qualify as evidence of something existing in the world. In order to show something exists in the world, you need some kind of further criteria to differentiate between the imaginary and what's real. And that's where science comes in. And science uses testable future predictions to do that. And so we have the testable future predictions kind of evidence can demonstrate things exist in the world physically, like horses and dogs and people and those kinds of things, because we have that physical kind of evidence. But arguments, no kind of argument is going to get us there. You can't say there's this new species of animal and here's an argument for it. That won't ever be good enough. The same thing applies to the historicity of miracles and magic, mythical creatures, all those kinds of things. Testimony for those things is never going to be good enough because it's a kind of conceptual evidence. You would need some kind of physical evidence to justify miracles and magic and mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, all of those kinds of things, because they're empirical kinds of claims about something in the world, as opposed to the conceptual evidence of someone's testimony.
Do you agree that empirical facts or empirical evidence can be placed into a philosophical argument?
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So this would not actually rule out ipso facto that an argument for God could be convincing. For example, the Kalam cosmological argument would take what it perceives could be false, like the premise may be false, but it's a valid argument in that the scientific claim that the universe began to exist, like that would be something that could be tested empirically, at least in theory. And then it's placed into a philosophical argument for the existence of God.
All right, absolutely. For example, I could say that anything that has fur is a mammal, dogs have fur, therefore dogs are mammals. Because that includes two empirical pieces of evidence, one that mammals have fur and two that dogs have fur, those empirical pieces of evidence in combination with the argument, the
Hmm.
conceptual argument, is what makes it a strong argument. So if you have both, that's perfectly fine. You can have the
Right.
conceptual testimony and the empirical evidence. Like, for example, if I said I
Yeah.
saw a dog, that would be
Yeah.
reasonable to believe because we have
No.
my testimony of the dog in addition to all of the empirical examples of dogs.
Sure.
But if I said
So
I saw a unicorn, that would not be good enough
correct.
because we
Yeah, I
only have
agree.
the conceptual and not the empirical.
Sure, I agree with that, of course. The point I was making, and it may not be a point at all, I'm just looking for clarification, was that there's not necessarily this infinite chasm between the different types. I don't know if you could call them knowledge or not, like the logical, the empirical, and the metaphysical. Like I just put all three there in an argument.
Oh, well, yes, but they're still different things. For example, you can't
Yeah, they're
use
different.
pure
Yeah, for sure.
conceptual knowledge to ever get to an empirical conclusion. For example, you can't use just the laws of logic to get to apples exist. There's no combination of the laws of logic that's ever going to indicate the existence of an apple. There's no
Yeah.
kind of
Well, the
philosophical law argument that you can present to indicate the existence of apples until you have the indication of the empirical evidence. So
okay.
you can combine them, that's totally fine. But if you're just having one kind, like just conceptual evidence, like logic and math and abstract laws, that'll never get you to any kind of empirical evidence. You
Okay, so
need
would
the
you
empirical in addition.
okay, so would you rule out a priori arguments for the existence of God then?
Probably.
Yeah.
So
Like an ontological argument.
yes, definitely.
Oh, okay. Just I think I got your epistemology square there. I think I understand it. That's what I was trying to do. Uh, where does this naturalistic pantheism? How does this come into this? What did it define it?
Right. So in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on pantheism, it gives a definition of naturalistic pantheism, which is that natural forces are adequate to explain everything in existence, and it grants nothing beyond the ontological commitments of science, or something like that.
Yeah.
The way I like to phrase it is a little bit differently. I like to simplify it down and take the properties of a God, which are all powerful, all knowing, all loving, personal, eternal, conscious, and just take three of those properties, which is just like necessary, eternal, all powerful, and then say these two or three properties are just all there is, and there's a natural thing that has these properties. So it's just a natural, eternal, all-powerful, or necessary something. And so I just phrase it like that. It's essentially the same thing as the complicated definition from the SEP, but it's an easier, more intuitive way to understand what it is. So it's just an eternal, all-powerful, or necessary nature
Hmm.
without the consciousness.
So you're okay. So you're not just taking the concept of God and shaving away a couple of things and calling it naturalistic pantheism.
No, I'm deliberately trying to use the properties of God as an analogy in order to make it make sense to theists, as opposed to just trying to use the scientific definition. But they are both independently coherent. So it's not contingent on God or God's properties. I'm just using them as a way to explain it.
Okay. Well, before we go, let's get off the heavy subjects. What are some things that you like to do for fun?
I like to bouldering, rock climbing, swing dancing, nightclubs and bars,
Yeah.
rollerblading. I bike 20 miles a day. I jog a 5K every day.
Dang, you jog a
Weightlifting.
5K every day?
Yeah, after biking 20 miles a day.
My goodness, up there in Minnesota, eh?
Yeah. Well, only in summer. I
Golly.
don't do this in
Only in
winter.
summer,
In winter, I just
not
give
in the
up.
cold.
In winter, I'm just
Okay.
like, nope, it's time to hibernate. This white
I
stuff on the ground is disgusting. Like, oh,
Golly. I'm in North Texas, so I think I told you yesterday when we were talking, I went on a bachelor party trip up to Minnesota to go ice fishing. Whose idea that is of a bachelor party, I don't know, but that's my friend wanted to do, so we went up there, and I did not know that they put these. Have you gone ice fishing?
yeah. The houses you're talking about, the mobile
Yeah, that's
houses they put on.
insane to me. So I live right next to Lake Texoma, which is never frozen. So I just doesn't even compute with me that you would put a house on a lake, frozen lake. Uh,
Yeah, you
man,
see people driving their cars onto a lake, and these people from Texas are like, what? Water
yeah,
can't do
exactly.
that.
Yeah, no, no, and you hear that ice crack, and it just echoes down the lake, and you're like, we're all gonna die. But yeah, that was crazy experience. It's way too cold up there for me. No way I could live in Minnesota.
Yeah,
But anyway, I really appreciate you allowing me to come on live and you coming on to my podcast. And so this was a lot of fun, but hopefully we can do it again another time. You got some debates coming up, you said, or something like that? Or you just had your first in-person live debate. Is that correct?
yeah. I just had my first live debate with Stephen Worthy in Newa, Wisconsin, at his church,
Yeah.
and I have a few debates coming up. I hope to get something set up with Ozzy. I forgot how to pronounce his name. He's a philosopher on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Ramazani is something like that. I don't know how to pronounce
Sure.
it. I also have something set up with Tyler Vela for October. He's a presuppositionalist. I have another
Well, that'd be fun.
interview on the 6th with someone who I've talked with before, Stellman, I believe. And I have a few, I think I have four more this month, one every week, and
Yeah.
it's three at least set up for next month. So definitely got more.
You got a lot going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm
Things
booked for like a month and a half in
Yeah,
advance.
things are going well for you, man. I'm glad to see that. Glad everything's going good over there at the channel and taking off. You says you're going full time now.
Yeah. Oh, actually, one more thing. I got a
Sure.
conversation with
Yeah.
Matt Slick I did, and it's
Oh,
going to
yeah.
be published in November because that's when the Gospel Truth guy who hosted it said he wanted to publish it. But that one, I'm really looking forward to that one. That was a good conversation.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I hope everything continues to go good for you, Tom. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to do this, and I'll see you next time, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope things go well for you too, and I hope you get on some big apologies. Maybe you can have us debate some on your channel sometime. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, it might be fun for sure.
Awesome. Well, talk to you later.
Yeah, see you later, bro.